welcome to Tales in the Dark. I know many of you enjoy relaxing with these videos, so I recommend turning down the volume until my voice is barely audible. It'll make the experience even more soothing. Before you close your eyes, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Over 99% of viewers aren't subscribed. It costs you nothing, but it's an enormous support for us to keep creating these relaxing stories. Thank you and enjoy listening. Story 1. The grandfather clock's gentle ticking filled the library with its steady rhythm, a comforting metronome that had accompanied my evening reading sessions for as long as I could remember. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows, creating a soothing percussion that blended with the timepiece's measured beats. The leather armchair embraced me in its familiar warmth as I turned another page of my weathered novel, its paper carrying that distinct scent of aged wisdom that only old books possess. A gust of autumn wind brushed against the house's wooden bones, drawing forth a deep, resonant creaking that seemed to echo through the walls. I lifted my eyes from the pages, letting them wander across the room's rich mahogany shelves, each one laden with volumes collected over generations. The warm glow of my reading lamp created a small island of light in the growing darkness, casting long shadows that danced slowly across the carpet whenever the flame flickered. It was then that I noticed something peculiar about the sound of the rain. While it pattered consistently against the front windows, there was an odd absence of sound from the library's rear wall, the one that should have faced the garden. I had never paid much attention to this detail before, but now that I had noticed it, the silence felt somehow wrong, like a missing note in a familiar melody. Setting my book aside, I rose from the chair, my sock-covered feet sinking into the thick carpet. The floor beneath was solid oak, yet it seemed to absorb my footsteps as I approached the back wall, leaving no echo, no creak, nothing to suggest I was moving at all. The shelves here were identical to all the others, filled with the same mix of classics and historical texts. Yet something about them felt different tonight. My fingers traced along the spines of the books, feeling the varied textures of leather, cloth, and paper bindings. The titles were all familiar. I had cataloged this section myself last spring. But as my hand moved along the shelf at eye level, I felt a slight draft, cool and fresh, coming from between two volumes of medieval history. Carefully, I removed the books, expecting to find perhaps a crack in the wall or a loose panel. Instead, my hands encountered something entirely unexpected. A small brass handle, worked into the wood with such skill that it would have been invisible had I not been running my fingers along that exact spot. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it had been recently handled, though I knew I was the only one who had been in the library for days. The handle seemed to fit my palm perfectly, its surface smooth from what must have been years of use, though I had never seen it before. A gentle tug revealed that it was connected to a concealed panel in the bookshelf. The craftsmanship was remarkable. When closed, the edges of the panel aligned perfectly with the wood grain of the shelf, making it virtually invisible. As I stood there, considering whether to pull the handle further, the grandfather clock struck 9. Each chime seemed to resonate differently than usual, the sound waves appearing to bend around the hidden panel, as if acknowledging its presence. The rain continued its gentle symphony against the front windows, but the silence from the garden side grew somehow deeper, more expectant. The logical part of my mind suggested leaving well enough alone. After all, in every story I'd ever read, hidden doors were hidden for a reason. But there was something about this discovery that felt different, not ominous or forbidding, but rather like finding a letter from a dear friend that had been misplaced for years. With gentle pressure, I pulled the handle. The panel swung outward silently, revealing a narrow passage behind the bookshelf. Cool air flowed from the opening, carrying with it a scent that was both familiar and strange, like old books mixed with fresh rain and something else, something I couldn't quite identify, but that reminded me of early morning walks in spring. The passage was lined with the same wood paneling as the library, but it had a peculiar quality to it. The grain seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, creating patterns that almost looked like writing. A soft illumination came from somewhere further in, not the harsh glare of electric lights, but something more akin to moonlight filtered through clouds. I stepped into the passage, noting how the floor felt solid yet somehow gave slightly under each step, like walking on packed sand at the beach. The air grew cooler as I moved further in, but not unpleasantly so. It was refreshing, like the first breath of autumn after a long summer. The passage curved gently to the left, and as I followed its arc, I began to hear something. It wasn't quite music, but rather the suggestion of music, the kind of sound you might hear in a dream and forget upon waking. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing neither louder nor softer as I walked. After what felt like both moments and hours, I came to another door. Unlike the hidden panel in the library, this one made no attempt to conceal itself. It was made of a wood I didn't recognize, darker than mahogany, but with a grain that seemed to glow faintly from within. There was no handle, only a simple copper plate at waist height. The music that wasn't music continued its ethereal melody as I stood before the door, studying its unusual surface. Touching the copper plate, I found it neither warm nor cool, but rather temperature neutral, as if it existed in perfect balance with my own skin. As I pressed my palm against it, the door began to open inward, moving with the same silent smoothness as the panel in the library. Beyond it lay a room that by all rights shouldn't have existed, couldn't have existed, given the dimensions of the house I knew so well. The space before me was vast, yet somehow intimate. Bookshelves stretched up into shadows that seemed to have no end, their contents obscured by a gentle mist that drifted between the stacks. The floor was the same wood as the passage, but here it was inlaid with swirling patterns of copper and silver that appeared to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. Scattered throughout the room were reading nooks, each one containing a different style of chair or couch, each one lit by what appeared to be captured moonlight held in glass globes. The air was filled with that same indefinable scent from the passage, stronger now, mixing with the familiar smell of books and the slight metallic tang of the copper inlays. As I stepped into the room, I noticed that my footsteps made no sound at all, despite the wooden floor. The mist parted before me and closed again behind, like a gentle curtain. The not quite music seemed to emanate from the very walls, or perhaps from the books themselves, creating a cocoon of sound that was both soothing and slightly otherworldly. Moving deeper into the room, I began to notice details that seemed to shift when I tried to focus on them. Books would change their titles when viewed twice, yet this didn't seem strange or frightening. Rather, it felt like they were offering different aspects of themselves to match my current thoughts and interests. I approached one of the reading nooks, drawn to a particularly comfortable-looking armchair that reminded me of the one in my library, yet seemed to be crafted from shadow and lamplight rather than conventional materials. As I sat down, the chair adjusted itself to my form perfectly, and I found myself eye level with a shelf of books that seemed to have been curated specifically for me. One volume in particular caught my attention. It had no title on its spine, but its cover was made of a material that seemed to ripple like water while remaining perfectly solid. When I reached for it, the book moved slightly, almost like a cat leaning into an offered hand. Opening the book, I found pages that seemed to be made of twilight, with words that floated just above the surface, rather than being printed on it. As I began to read, I realized that the story was familiar. It was my own, but written from a perspective I had never considered before, showing me aspects of my life that I had somehow missed while living it. Time began to lose its meaning as I read. The grandfather clock's chimes reached me from what seemed like a great distance, but I couldn't be sure if minutes or hours were passing between them. The rain continued its gentle percussion, though I knew the library's windows were now far behind me. As I read deeper into the book, I began to understand that this room was more than just a secret space. It was a nexus of sorts, a place where stories came to rest when they weren't being told, where memories waited to be rediscovered, and where thoughts went to mature when we weren't actively thinking them. The mist continued its lazy dance between the shelves, occasionally forming shapes that almost looked like letters or faces before dissolving again. The copper and silver patterns in the floor followed their own mysterious choreography, their movements somehow synchronized with both the mist above and the not-quite music that filled the air. I'm not sure how long I sat there, reading about my life from that new perspective, but eventually I became aware of a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. The moonlight in the glass globes had shifted its angle, suggesting that time was indeed passing in the world beyond the hidden door. Reluctantly, I closed the book, watching as the twilight pages settled back into their water-like cover. When I placed it back on the shelf, it seemed to adjust its position slightly, finding its perfect place among its companions. Standing from the chair, I noticed that the mist had grown slightly thicker, though still transparent enough to see through. As I made my way back toward the door, I realized that I could no longer remember exactly how many turns the passage had taken, or even how long I had walked before finding the second door. Yet somehow this didn't worry me. The way back felt as natural as the path home from a childhood friend's house, more muscle memory than conscious thought. The copper plate on the door seemed to warm slightly under my touch this time, and as the door opened, I caught one last impression of that vast room, the endless shelves, the drifting mist, the moving patterns in the floor, before stepping back into the passage. The walk back seemed shorter, though the quality of the air and the almost music remained the same. When I reached the panel that led to my library, I found it exactly as I had left it, standing open and waiting. The grandfather clock was just striking midnight as I emerged, though it felt as if I had been gone for both minutes and centuries. Carefully, I closed the panel, watching as it seamlessly blended back into the bookshelf. The brass handle seemed to fade away under my fingers, though I knew it would be there if I needed to find it again. I replaced the books I had removed, their spines lining up perfectly with their neighbors. Returning to my armchair, I picked up the novel I had been reading earlier. The leather was warm, as if I had just set it down, and the rain continued its gentle pattern against the front windows. The silence from the garden wall no longer seemed strange. Rather, it felt like a reminder of what lay behind it, waiting. As I settled back into reading, I realized that something had changed, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The words on the page seemed to have gained a new depth, as if they too might float above the paper if I looked at them from the right angle. The grandfather clock's ticking felt more like a conversation than a mere marking of time, and the shadows cast by my reading lamp appeared to hold secrets just waiting to be discovered. I often think about that night, about the door that appeared in my library and the room that couldn't possibly exist. Sometimes, when I'm reading late into the evening, I catch myself listening for that not quite music, or watching the shadows for signs of drifting mist. I've never told anyone else about what I found, partly because I'm not sure they would believe me, but mostly because it feels like a secret that prefers to remain unspoken. The brass handle is still there, waiting behind those books on the shelf, though I've never seen it in full daylight. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights when the rain taps against the front windows and the back wall stands in inexplicable silence, I find my fingers itching to trace along those book spines again, to seek out that warm metal that opens the way to somewhere else. But I've learned that such doors reveal themselves only when the time is right, when the rain falls in just the right rhythm, and the clock's chimes bend around corners that might not actually exist. Until then, I content myself with reading my books, listening to the rain, and wondering about the stories that wait in that misty room, written on pages made of twilight, waiting for someone to find the door that leads to them. Story 2. The old typewriter sat quietly in my study, its metal frame catching the soft amber light from my desk lamp. Rain tapped gently against the window panes, creating a soothing rhythm that filled the room with its natural melody. I had inherited this vintage Remington from my grandmother, along with her old wooden desk and a collection of leather-bound books that lined the shelves of my home office. On this particular autumn evening, the air carried a peculiar weight, heavy with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang that precedes a storm. The wooden floorboards beneath my feet had grown warm from the heating system, creating a cozy atmosphere that invited contemplation and creativity. As I settled into my grandmother's worn leather chair, my fingers instinctively reached for the typewriter's keys, their ivory surfaces smooth and familiar beneath my touch. Something felt different about the machine tonight. The keys seemed to hold a subtle warmth, as if someone had been typing just moments before I entered the room. I dismissed the thought, attributing it to the heating system's efficiency, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly amiss in my usually predictable sanctuary. Pulling a fresh sheet of paper from my drawer, I inserted it into the typewriter with practiced ease. The paper settled into place with a satisfying click, its pristine surface awaiting the impact of the metal keys. As I positioned my fingers over the home row, preparing to begin my evening writing session, a soft whirring sound emerged from within the typewriter's mechanism. The keys began to move on their own, each one pressing down with deliberate precision. The gentle clacking filled the room, harmonizing with the rainfall outside. I watched, transfixed, as words appeared on the paper, one letter at a time. My dearest reader, I've been waiting for someone to find this message. My hands remained hovering above the keys, not daring to interfere with whatever force had taken control of my grandmother's typewriter. The typing continued, each keystroke measured and purposeful. There are stories that need telling, whispers from between the worlds that seek a voice. I've chosen you to be their keeper. The scent of ozone grew stronger, mingling with the musty perfume of aging books. In the soft lamplight, I noticed that the shadows cast by the typewriter seemed to move independently of the light source, dancing across the paper like curious spirits examining their own handiwork. The message continued to unfold. Within these keys lies a tale that was never written, yet has always existed. It dwells in the spaces between thoughts, in the quiet moments before sleep claims consciousness. Will you help me tell it? A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear, but from a deep sense of recognition. The typing style mirrored my grandmother's, the same subtle hesitation before punctuation marks, the same slight unevenness in the pressure applied to the vowels. I had spent countless hours studying her manuscripts, learning from her technique, and now her typewriter seemed to be channeling her essence. The room's atmosphere grew heavier, as if the air itself was becoming saturated with untold stories. The leather-bound books on my shelves seemed to lean forward slightly, their spines creaking with anticipation. In the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of movement among the shadows, like characters waiting in the wings of a theater, eager to take their place on the stage. More words appeared on the paper. Every night at this hour, When the boundary between reality and imagination grows thin, I will share with you fragments of the story. But remember, once begun, it must be completed. These tales have waited too long in silence. The typing slowed, becoming more deliberate. Look closely at the books on your shelves. Notice how some titles seem to shift when viewed from different angles. Those are the stories that exist in potential, waiting to be given form through words. I turned toward my bookshelves, and indeed, some of the gold-leaf titles appeared to shimmer and change. Books I had known for years suddenly seemed unfamiliar, their spines displaying titles I had never seen before, only to revert to their original text when I blinked. The typewriter continued its mysterious communication. Your grandmother understood the responsibility of being a keeper of unwritten tales. She spent years collecting them, creating safe harbors for stories that existed only in the realm of possibility. Now that duty passes to you. The keys moved more slowly now, as if the force behind them was gathering its thoughts. Each night, sit at this desk when the clock strikes midnight. Place your hands on these keys and allow yourself to become a conduit. The stories will flow through you, seeking their way onto paper, transforming from potential into reality. A gentle breeze stirred the papers on my desk, though all windows were closed. The lamp's light flickered momentarily, and in that brief darkness, I could have sworn I saw faint, luminous words floating in the air around the typewriter. But be warned, the keys continued their dance. These stories have their own will, their own destiny. Once you begin transcribing them, you must see them through to their natural conclusion. An unfinished story is like a door left open. It creates a passage through which the boundaries between what is and what might be become dangerously thin. The typing paused, and in that moment of silence, I became acutely aware of the sound of my own breathing, syncopated with the steady rainfall outside. The books on my shelves seemed to pulse with a subtle energy, their pages rustling without any discernible cause. The message resumed. Your grandmother left this typewriter to you for a reason. She saw in you the same ability she possessed, the capacity to perceive the stories that exist in the spaces between reality and imagination. She knew you would eventually discover its true purpose. My fingers tingled with a gentle electric sensation, as if responding to an unseen current flowing through the typewriter. The keys continued their mysterious revelation. Even now, countless tales are gathering, drawn to this moment, to this space where they might finally find expression. Can you feel them? They're here in this room, swirling around you like autumn leaves in a gentle whirlwind, waiting to be caught and pinned to paper with words. The typing slowed once more, each letter appearing with careful precision. When you're ready to begin, place your hands on these keys and close your eyes. The first story will find you. Don't try to guide it, simply let it flow through you. Remember, you're not creating these tales, you're discovering them, giving form to narratives that have always existed in the realm of possibility. I watched as the final words emerged on the paper. The choice is yours, but know that these stories have chosen you. They will wait patiently for your decision, but they cannot wait forever. Some tales, if left untold for too long, fade back into the ether of unrealized possibilities, lost perhaps for generations until another keeper of unwritten books appears. The typewriter fell silent, its keys still. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my response. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, but now it seemed to carry a rhythm, almost like words just beyond the threshold of understanding. I sat there in the amber light, considering the message before me. The typewriter waited patiently, its keys holding that same subtle warmth I had noticed earlier. On my shelves, the books continued their silent dance of shifting titles, offering glimpses of stories yet to be told. As I finally placed my fingers on the keys, I felt a gentle current of energy flow through them. and somewhere in the depths of my mind, I began to perceive the first whispers of a story seeking its way into existence. The boundaries between what was and what might be grew just a little bit thinner, and I understood that my grandmother's legacy was far more profound than I had ever imagined. The rain continued its steady rhythm, the lamp cast its warm glow, and in the quiet of my study, surrounded by books both written and unwritten, I prepared to begin my journey as a keeper of untold tales. The typewriter hummed softly beneath my fingers, ready to transform possibility into reality, one letter at a time. Story 3. The gentle patter of rain against glass filled my study as I sat in my favorite armchair, wrapped in the soft warmth of a woolen blanket. The house creaked and settled around me, its ancient wooden bones adjusting to the dampness of the autumn evening. A cup of chamomile tea sent delicate tendrils of steam into the air, carrying with it the soothing scent of honey and herbs. I had always found comfort in my evening ritual of reading by lamplight, but tonight something felt different. The usual golden glow of my reading lamp seemed to cast unfamiliar shadows on the walls, and the familiar corners of the room held depths I had never noticed before. Perhaps it was the weather, or perhaps it was the peculiar book I had discovered earlier that day while organizing my library. A leather-bound volume with no title, its pages filled with handwritten notes in a script I couldn't quite decipher. The book lay closed on the side table now, its presence somehow more substantial than its modest size would suggest. My fingers traced the worn leather spine, feeling the subtle irregularities that decades, perhaps centuries, had carved into its surface. The rain continued its quiet symphony, punctuated by the occasional low rumble of distant thunder. As I reached for my tea, a movement caught my eye, a subtle shift in the quality of darkness beyond the window. My study was on the second floor, and this particular window had always faced the sprawling oak tree that dominated our backyard. But tonight, as I turned my head to look, I saw nothing. Not darkness, not the rain-soaked branches of the oak, not even the faint glow of distant houses. Just nothing. The sensation was difficult to describe, like trying to explain the taste of water or the feeling of air against skin. The window seemed to frame a perfect void, a rectangle of absolute absence that somehow felt more substantial than the wall around it. I blinked several times, expecting my eyes to adjust, to reveal the familiar nighttime landscape. They didn't. Setting down my teacup with deliberate care, I rose from my chair. The floorboards whispered beneath my feet as I approached the window. The rain continued to strike the glass, creating rivulets that should have reflected the lamp's light, but they didn't. The water simply disappeared into that impossible darkness, as if flowing into an infinite depth. My hand lifted of its own accord, fingers extending toward the glass. The window felt cold, colder than it should have been even on this autumn night. Beneath my fingertips, I could feel the vibrations of the raindrops, but they seemed to carry a rhythm that didn't quite match the sound reaching my ears. Withdrawing my hand, I noticed something peculiar. The leather-bound book on the side table had fallen open, its pages ruffling slightly, though there was no breeze in the room. As I turned to look at it, the handwritten script seemed to shift and flow, like ink refusing to settle on the page. Among the indecipherable characters, a single word stood out with sudden clarity: window. I returned to my chair, picking up the book with hands that trembled only slightly. The script continued to move, but now and then, words would emerge from the chaos: threshold, void, waiting. Each word hung in my mind for a moment before dissolving back into the flowing text, like stones briefly surfacing in a swift stream. The rain grew heavier, its rhythm becoming more insistent. I found myself reading aloud, though I couldn't understand the words leaving my lips. They felt ancient and somehow right, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. As I read, the darkness in the window seemed to deepen, if that was possible, becoming more than mere absence of light. A soft sound drew my attention. The quiet click of my bedroom door falling shut somewhere down the hallway. I hadn't left it open. The house was empty save for me, had been empty since my grandmother's passing 3 months ago. Yet I could hear slow, deliberate footsteps making their way toward the study. I should have been frightened, but the strange peace that had settled over me remained unbroken. The footsteps drew closer, each one accompanied by a slight creak of the floorboards that I knew so well. They stopped just outside the study door. The handle didn't turn, but somehow I knew that whatever was out there was waiting, listening. The book in my hands had grown warm, and I noticed that the flowing script had stilled. The page before me now showed a detailed drawing of a window, rendered in ink so dark it seemed to swallow the lamplight. Below it was a single line of text, written in clear English. Some windows are doors, and some doors should remain closed. I looked up at the window again. The void remained, but now I could sense something more, a presence, a vastness that seemed to peer back at me through that rectangular frame. The rain had stopped, though I couldn't say when. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the faint rustle of pages as the book closed itself in my lap. The footsteps in the hallway began again, but now they were moving away, growing fainter until they faded entirely. I sat there for what felt like hours, though the clock on my mantel never moved from 11:11. The tea beside me had grown cold, its surface as still as glass. Eventually I rose and drew the heavy curtains across the window. The fabric seemed to hang more heavily than usual, as if it were holding back more than just the night. I carefully returned the book to its shelf, though I couldn't recall which space it had originally occupied. Every spine now looked equally worn, equally mysterious. That was 3 weeks ago. The window now remains covered at all times, though sometimes, late at night, I can hear the curtains rustling despite the absence of any breeze. The book hasn't reappeared, though I've searched the library several times. But sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, words in that flowing script dance behind my closed eyelids, and I wonder about what lies beyond that window, the window that faces nothing, yet seems to gaze back at everything. The footsteps return occasionally, always at 11:11, always stopping just outside my study door. I've never opened it to look, never tried to catch a glimpse of whatever walks my hallway in those moments. Some questions are better left unanswered, some doors better left closed, and some windows, I've learned, are best left curtained, lest they reveal the nothing that stares back. On particularly quiet nights, when the house holds its breath and the clock approaches that meaningful hour, I sit in my armchair and sip chamomile tea. Sometimes I imagine I can hear whispered conversations in that ancient script, carried on the edge of silence. Sometimes I think I understand them. Those are the nights I hold my blanket closest, waiting for the footsteps that never fail to arrive and never reveal their source. The curtains stir again as I write these words, though the air is still. Perhaps something is waiting there, in that impossible void beyond the glass. Perhaps it has always been waiting, throughout all the years this house has stood, throughout all the generations that have passed before me. Or perhaps the nothing that lies beyond that window is precisely that, nothing at all. I choose to believe the latter. It's easier that way, safer. But I keep the curtains drawn, and I've stopped reading in the study after sunset. Some mysteries, after all, are best left unexplored. Some windows should remain covered, and some stories, like this one, should end with questions rather than answers. The clock reads 11:10, and I hear footsteps on the stairs. Story 4. The steady patter of autumn rain against the window panes filled my grandmother's old Victorian house with a gentle, rhythmic melody. I had inherited the property just 3 weeks ago, and each evening since then, I found myself drawn to the atmospheric quiet of the library, where the soft glow of antique brass lamps cast warm pools of light across dark wooden shelves. That particular evening, I sat in a high-backed leather armchair, listening to the rain while sorting through boxes of my grandmother's belongings. The air carried the comforting scent of old books, leather, and the faintest trace of lavender, her favorite perfume that somehow still lingered in the fabric of the curtains. Outside, branches swayed in the wind, their shadows dancing across the room's burgundy wallpaper like gentle waves. As I reached into another cardboard box, my fingers brushed against something solid wrapped in brown paper and twine. Carefully untying the delicate knots, I revealed a portrait I had never seen before. An oil painting of a woman in a deep emerald dress, seated before a window with heavy velvet drapes. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each brush stroke deliberate and refined, creating an almost photographic level of detail. But it was her eyes that caught my attention. Deep brown with flecks of gold, they seemed to hold an unusual depth, as if the artist had somehow captured not just their appearance, but their very essence. I found myself lost in that gaze, mesmerized by the way the painted irises seemed to catch the lamplight. Setting the portrait against the wall beside my chair, I continued sorting through papers, though I couldn't shake the feeling that those painted eyes were watching my movements. Several times I glanced back at the portrait, but each time it appeared exactly as it should, just pigments on canvas, nothing more. As the evening deepened, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof in a soothing cascade. The old house creaked and settled around me, its familiar sounds mixing with the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I began to feel drowsy, my thoughts growing soft and hazy at the edges. Perhaps that's why I didn't immediately notice the subtle change in the portrait. It wasn't until I reached for my teacup that I caught it in my peripheral vision, the slight shift in the painted woman's expression. Where before her lips had been set in a neutral line, now they seemed to hold the ghost of a smile. I blinked slowly, attributing the change to shadows cast by the flickering lamplight. Yet when I looked directly at the portrait again, I could have sworn her head was tilted at a slightly different angle. The eyes that had seemed so captivating before now held something more, an awareness, an intelligence that sent a whisper of unease down my spine. Setting aside the papers in my lap, I leaned forward to examine the painting more closely. The brush strokes remained exactly as they had been, each one clearly visible upon inspection. But when I sat back again, letting my eyes unfocus slightly, the overall impression was somehow different. The woman appeared more present, more real, as if the flat canvas had gained impossible depth. A soft crackle from the fireplace drew my attention away for a moment. When I looked back, I noticed a detail I had somehow missed before, a small silver locket around the woman's neck, painted with such precision that I could make out tiny engraved initials. I leaned closer, trying to decipher them in the warm lamplight. The sound of a throat clearing made me freeze. It had come from directly in front of me, from the direction of the portrait. But that was impossible. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight with resonant chimes that seemed to vibrate through the hushed library. "Isabella," whispered a voice, soft as falling leaves. "My dear Isabella." I knew I should feel terrified, but strangely I didn't. The voice carried no malice, only a profound sadness and longing that seemed to echo in the very air around me. Slowly I raised my eyes to meet those of the painted woman. She was looking directly at me now, all pretense of being a simple portrait abandoned. Her eyes brimmed with tears that somehow caught the lamplight, though they never fell. The slight smile I had noticed earlier trembled at the corners of her mouth. "You look so much like her," the painted woman said, her voice carrying the weightless quality of wind through empty halls. Like my Isabella. My grandmother's name had been Isabella. Who are you? I asked, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. Margaret, she replied. I was her grandmother's dearest friend. We shared everything, our hopes, our secrets, our fears. When consumption took me, I couldn't bear the thought of leaving her alone. The artist who painted this portrait understood such things. He knew ways to capture more than mere appearance. The rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows as Margaret told me her story. She spoke of a time long past, of friendship so deep it transcended death itself, of an artist who worked with paints mixed with stranger substances than oil and pigment. As she talked, the lamplight seemed to soften, creating a bubble of warmth that held just the two of us. I've watched over her family ever since, Margaret said. Over you. On nights when the barrier between what is and what was grows thin, I can speak to those with the patience to listen. I found myself sharing my own stories then, memories of my grandmother, of growing up visiting this house, of quiet moments in this very library. Margaret listened with those incredible eyes, commenting softly, laughing gently at times. The hours flowed past like water. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows, I noticed Margaret's image starting to still, her presence growing fainter. The morning comes, she said with that same soft smile. But I'll be here, watching over you as I always have, as I promised her I would. The portrait returned to its original state as the sun rose, though now I could see what I had missed before. The profound love and protection in those painted eyes, the subtle curve of lips that had spoken such extraordinary things through the night. I never moved the portrait from its place in the library. On quiet evenings when the rain falls and the house creaks with its ancient memories, I often sit in that high-backed leather chair, sorting through old papers or reading. Sometimes, when the light is just right and the barrier between then and now grows thin, I catch the whisper of Margaret's voice, sharing stories of times long past. And always, those eyes watch over me with gentle care, keeping a promise made generations ago, painted in colors far deeper than any artist's oils could capture alone. The mystery of Margaret's portrait became part of my life in that old house, neither fully explained nor completely inexplicable. On some nights, I imagine I can hear her humming an old lullaby, her painted voice mixing with the sound of rain against the windows. Other times, the portrait appears completely ordinary, though the eyes never fail to hold that spark of something more. I've learned to accept this beautiful uncertainty, this gentle haunting that feels more like a blessing than a curse. The library has become my favorite room in the house, filled with the comfort of books, the warmth of lamplight, and the watchful presence of a love strong enough to reach across the years. As I write this now, sitting in my grandmother's library while autumn rain drums against the roof, I can feel Margaret's painted eyes upon me. There's no fear in that sensation, only the profound peace that comes from knowing that some bonds transcend all ordinary boundaries, wrapped in mysteries we need not fully understand to deeply cherish. In the end, perhaps that's what the portrait truly captured. Not just the image of a woman in an emerald dress, but the eternal nature of love itself, watching over us with eyes that never truly close, painted in colors that never fully fade. Story 5. The soft glow of the antique wall sconces cast gentle shadows along the wallpapered corridor of the old mansion, their light barely strong enough to illuminate the intricate patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the dimness. The air carried the subtle scent of aged wood and leather-bound books, mingled with the earthy fragrance of the rain that had been falling steadily since sunset. I stood at the beginning of the hallway, my wool-socked feet sinking into the plush carpet that ran its length. The grandfather clock behind me marked each second with a deep, resonant tick that seemed to echo through the quietness of the evening. Its familiar rhythm had always brought me comfort during my stay at my great-aunt's estate. But tonight, something felt different about its steady count of passing time. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop that should have lulled me toward sleep. Instead, I found myself drawn to investigate a peculiar detail that had caught my attention during my nightly walk to the kitchen. The corridor seemed longer than I remembered. Not dramatically so, but just enough to notice, like a sweater that has been stretched ever so slightly in the wash. I took a few steps forward, running my fingers along the textured wallpaper. The slight roughness beneath my fingertips helped ground me in reality as my mind tried to make sense of the subtle wrongness before me. The corridor had always housed 8 doors, 4 on each side, leading to various rooms. Now, in the diffused lamplight, I could make out what appeared to be a 9th door at the far end. The wool carpet muffled my footsteps as I moved forward, counting the doors on either side. 1, 2, 3, 4 on the right. 1, 2, 3, 4 on the left. And yet, there it was, an additional door, standing quietly at the end of the hall, where there should have been only the large landscape painting of a misty mountain scene that Great-Aunt Helena had brought back from her travels. A subtle draft whispered past me, carrying with it the faintest trace of lavender, my great-aunt's favorite scent. She had passed away 6 months ago, leaving me this grand old house with all its peculiarities and secrets. The lavender should have faded by now, and yet here it was, as fresh as if she had just walked by. The temperature seemed to drop slightly as I approached the end of the corridor. The wallpaper pattern, which I had always found to be an elegant arrangement of vines and leaves, began to appear more organic, more alive in the play of shadow and light. I could have sworn I saw the vines shift ever so slightly, but when I focused my attention on any particular section, it remained perfectly still. I reached the 9th door, my hand hovering over its brass handle. Unlike the other doors in the corridor, this one had no keyhole, no defining features beyond its simple wooden frame and aged brass fixtures. The wood felt warm beneath my palm as I placed my hand flat against its surface, warmer than it should have been in the cool evening air. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to slow, each second stretching longer than the last. A gentle vibration thrummed through the door and into my hand, reminiscent of a cat's purr. The sensation was not unpleasant. Rather, it felt welcoming, almost familiar, like the touch of a long-forgotten friend. As I stood there, contemplating whether to turn the handle, I noticed another peculiar detail. The corridor behind me appeared to have lengthened again. The grandfather clock, which should have been visible at the other end, now seemed further away, its ticking slightly muted as if heard through layers of velvet. The rain's rhythm against the windows had changed as well, becoming more melodic, almost musical. If I listened carefully, I could almost make out a pattern in the droplets, like a conversation happening just below the threshold of understanding. The lavender scent grew stronger, mixing with new fragrances, old books, Earl Grey tea, and something else, something undefined yet achingly familiar. I found myself swaying slightly, moved by the gentle symphony of rain and clock and the house's own breathing. The warmth from the door spread up my arm, bringing with it a profound sense of peace. The logical part of my mind suggested that I should be frightened, or at least concerned by these impossible changes. Instead, I felt only a deep curiosity and an unexpected sense of homecoming. The wallpaper patterns continued their subtle dance in my peripheral vision, and now I could see that they were indeed moving, flowing like seaweed in a gentle current. The vines curved and stretched, forming shapes that almost resembled letters before dissolving back into their organic flow. The entire corridor seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting in time with my own breath. As I finally wrapped my fingers around the brass handle, I noticed that the other doors had begun to fade, becoming less substantial, like photographs losing their clarity. The corridor stretched impossibly behind me now, the grandfather clock's ticking transformed into a distant heartbeat. The rain's melody had evolved into a soft humming that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. The door handle turned smoothly under my grip, without the usual creak of aged metal. A warm light spilled from the crack as the door began to open. Not the harsh glare of electric bulbs, but something softer, more natural, like captured sunshine. The lavender scent swirled around me, and with it came memories, not just of my great-aunt Helena, but of times and places I had never known yet somehow remembered. I stood on the threshold, one foot on the familiar carpet, the other hovering over what lay beyond. The light beckoned, warm and inviting, carrying with it whispers of stories untold and mysteries waiting to be discovered. Behind me, the corridor continued its impossible expansion, the grandfather clock now just a distant memory of time. What lay beyond the door was neither frightening nor finite. It was a continuation, a passage into something both new and eternally present. As I took that final step forward, I understood that the corridor had not really changed. It had simply revealed its true nature, a path that had always existed, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. The door closed softly behind me, though I couldn't say whether I had pulled it shut or if it had moved of its own accord. In the end, I supposed it didn't matter. The endless corridor had led me exactly where I needed to be, though I'm still not certain whether I found it or it found me. Sometimes on quiet nights when the rain falls and time grows soft at the edges, I think I can still hear the grandfather clock ticking, counting the seconds in a corridor that continues to stretch beyond the boundaries of what we think we know. And if you ever find yourself in an old house, watching the wallpaper shift in the lamplight, pay attention to that ninth door that wasn't there before. It might just be waiting for you too. Story 6. The steady patter of rain against the window panes filled the library with a gentle rhythm as I sorted through the old books and papers my grandfather had left behind. The soft glow of my desk lamp cast warm shadows across the weathered spines and yellowed pages, creating an intimate cocoon of light in the growing darkness of the evening. A cup of chamomile tea steamed beside me, its delicate aroma mingling with the musty scent of aged paper and leather bindings. Among the countless volumes and journals, I discovered a leather-bound notebook, its pages warped with age and filled with my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The ink had faded to a warm sepia, but the words remained clear, drawing me into their mysterious narrative. As I began to read, the rain seemed to fade into a distant whisper, and the world beyond the library's walls melted away. October 15th, 1947, I have made a remarkable discovery on the old estate grounds. While examining the overgrown gardens behind the greenhouse, I noticed an unusual depression in the earth, partially hidden beneath decades of fallen leaves and vegetation. Upon clearing away the debris, I found a stone well of exceptional craftsmanship, its walls constructed from perfectly fitted blocks of a curious dark stone I've never encountered before. The well appears to be incredibly deep. When I dropped a small stone into its depths, I never heard it strike bottom. Most peculiar of all, the stone's descent made no sound whatsoever, as if it had been swallowed by absolute silence. The rain grew heavier as I continued reading, drumming against the roof in a soothing cascade. My grandfather's entries became increasingly detailed, describing his growing obsession with the well's mysterious properties. He wrote of experiments with various objects, stones, leaves, even drops of water, all of which disappeared into the darkness without a trace. December 3rd, 1947. The well defies all logical explanation. I've borrowed sophisticated measuring equipment from the university, yet none can detect its true depth. When I lower a weighted line into its mouth, the rope simply continues to unspool endlessly. Even more bewildering are the sounds, or rather, the absence of sounds. The well seems to absorb all noise directed into it, creating a pocket of absolute silence that feels almost alive. But there is something else, something I hesitate to commit to paper for fear of appearing mad. On certain nights when the moon is full and the air is perfectly still, I've observed a faint luminescence emanating from the well's depths. The light, if it can be called that, seems to pulse with a rhythm that reminds me of breathing. My tea had grown cold as I lost myself in my grandfather's account. The library's shadows had deepened, and the rain now fell in a gentle, hypnotic cadence. I found myself leaning closer to the pages, drawn deeper into the mystery. January 15, 1948. I've begun to notice subtle changes in the area surrounding the well. The grass grows differently there, following patterns that seem to spiral outward from the well's mouth. The local wildlife appears to both avoid and be drawn to the location. Birds circle it endlessly but never land, while insects gather in unusual formations nearby. Most notably, the well seems to affect time itself in its immediate vicinity. My pocket watch runs slower when I'm near it, and I found myself losing track of hours while conducting my observations. The darkness at the bottom of the well isn't merely an absence of light. It feels like a tangible thing, a presence that watches and waits. The following entries detailed my grandfather's increasingly careful documentation of the well's effects. He wrote of unusual dreams, of hearing whispered conversations in languages he didn't recognize, of catching glimpses of impossible geometries in the well's depths. His handwriting remained steady and precise, but there was an underlying tension in his words, a sense of both wonder and unease. March 30th, 1948. The well has begun to reveal more of its nature, though each answer only leads to deeper questions. I've discovered that objects dropped into it at precisely midnight sometimes return, changed in subtle ways. A silver coin emerged tarnished with patterns I've never seen in any metalwork. A fallen leaf reappeared with veins that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Most remarkably, I've started to hear what I can only describe as music emanating from the depths, not sound in any conventional sense, but rather a harmony of silence, a pattern in the void that resonates with something deep within the human mind. It comes and goes with no discernible pattern, but its effect is profound. When it occurs, time seems to flow differently, and the boundary between dreaming and waking becomes remarkably thin. The rain had softened to a gentle mist outside, and the library had grown darker. I lit a second lamp, creating a wider circle of warmth around me. The next series of entries spoke of my grandfather's attempts to map the well's influence on its surroundings. He had created intricate diagrams showing how the unusual patterns in the grass had spread, how the local magnetic fields had begun to shift, how even the stars seemed to look different when viewed from near the well's mouth. June 21st, 1948. Today, on the summer solstice, the well revealed something extraordinary. As the sun reached its zenith, I observed what appeared to be reflections in the darkness below, not of the sky above, but of other skies, filled with constellations I've never seen. For a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of what looked like architecture, impossibly vast structures that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that shouldn't be possible. The experience has left me with a profound sense of our universe's true nature. The well isn't simply a hole in the ground. It's a window, perhaps even a door, to something far beyond our current understanding. The question that haunts me now is, what lies on the other side of that threshold, and is it similarly aware of us? The final entries in the journal became more contemplative, filled with philosophical musings about the nature of reality and our place within it. My grandfather wrote of developing a theory that the well was actually far older than the estate, older perhaps than human civilization itself. He believed it might be one of many such places around the world, points where the fabric of reality had worn thin. September 15th, 1948. After months of observation and documentation, I've come to understand that the well's true nature may be beyond human comprehension. It exists as a reminder that our world is far stranger and more wonderful than we imagine. I've decided to seal the well's entrance, not out of fear, but out of respect for its mystery. Some questions are better left as questions, their answers preserved in the realm of possibility, rather than certainty. I will miss the music of its silence, the way it made me question everything I thought I knew about the universe. But I take comfort in knowing it remains there, beneath the earth, a testament to the endless wonder that surrounds us. If only we have the courage to look into the darkness and acknowledge the vastness of what we don't understand. The journal ended there, though several blank pages remained. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, leaving behind a profound silence that seemed to echo the well's mysterious depths. I closed the journal carefully, my mind full of questions. My grandfather had included a small map showing the well's location, and I found myself wondering if it remained sealed, waiting in the darkness behind the old greenhouse. As I prepared to leave the library, I noticed something curious. My reflection in the window seemed slightly out of sync with my movements, as if time itself had begun to flow differently. And in the distance, just at the edge of hearing, I thought I caught a whisper of that strange harmony my grandfather had described, a music made of silence, calling from somewhere deep beneath the earth. I placed the journal back among my grandfather's papers, but I knew I would return to it. The well's mystery had taken root in my mind, just as it had in his. As I walked home through the misty evening, I found myself paying closer attention to the shadows, to the spaces between things, wondering what other doorways might exist in the world, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look into the darkness and acknowledge the beauty of the unknown. The soft sounds of night surrounded me, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in a gentle breeze, the distant call of an owl. But beneath it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that another kind of silence was listening, waiting, breathing in the depths of a well that had no bottom, in a darkness that had no end. Story 7. The soft patter of autumn rain against the window panes filled my study as I examined the curious letter that had arrived that morning. The paper felt oddly thick between my fingers, with a texture reminiscent of parchment made from natural materials rather than modern manufacturing. The handwriting flowed across the page in elegant strokes of deep brown ink, almost the color of aged wood. "My dear friend," it began, though I couldn't recall knowing anyone who would address me in such a formal manner. "I write to you regarding a matter of great archaeological significance. During my recent explorations, I discovered a network of caves unlike any documented before. The acoustics within are extraordinary. Sounds seem to linger far longer than natural physics would suggest possible. But more intriguing still are the echoes that appear to respond in patterns that cannot be explained by simple reflection of sound waves. I require your expertise in audio analysis to help document this phenomenon. Would you consider joining me for a brief expedition?" The letter was signed simply Professor Wells, with no return address or contact information. Under normal circumstances, I might have dismissed such a cryptic invitation, but something about the precise way the writer described the acoustic anomalies caught my professional attention. As someone who had spent years studying architectural acoustics and sound engineering, I found myself inexplicably drawn to the mystery. The directions included were equally peculiar. A series of landmarks leading deep into old forest land, far from any major roads or settlements. The autumn air carried a hint of wood smoke and decaying leaves as I drove along increasingly narrow roads, following the letter's careful instructions. The rain had settled into a gentle mist that seemed to soften all edges of the world around me. When I finally reached the designated meeting point, I found myself alone in a small clearing. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their branches weaving together to create a natural canopy that filtered the weak afternoon light. The mist had thickened, wrapping around the tree trunks like ghostly fingers. The only sound was the gentle dripping of moisture from leaf to leaf, creating a soothing natural rhythm. I checked my watch, 3:45 p.m., exactly the time specified in the letter. As I waited, I became aware of a subtle vibration in the air, more felt than heard. It reminded me of the way sound waves can sometimes be perceived through bone conduction rather than through the ear canal. Following this sensation, I noticed a narrow path leading away from the clearing, barely visible through the undergrowth. The path wound downward, becoming steeper as I descended. The tree roots had formed natural steps, worn smooth by what must have been years of passage. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying with it the mineral scent of underground water and raw earth. The entrance to the cave system revealed itself gradually, a dark opening in the hillside, partially obscured by hanging vines and moss. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The entrance tunnel was surprisingly regular, almost as if it had been carefully carved rather than naturally formed. The walls were smooth, with occasional striations that caught the light in unusual ways. As I moved deeper into the cave, I began to notice how my footsteps created distinct echoes, each one seeming to carry further than it should. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and it was here that I first experienced what the letter had described. When I cleared my throat, the sound returned to me not as a simple echo, but as a complex series of reverberations that seemed to carry meaning beyond mere acoustic reflection. It was as if the cave itself was attempting to communicate through the manipulation of sound waves. I set up my recording equipment, carefully positioning microphones to capture the acoustic properties of the space. As I worked, I became aware of other sounds at the edge of perception, whispers that might have been water dropping in distant chambers, or perhaps something else entirely. The temperature continued to drop, and I pulled my jacket closer around me. Hours passed as I conducted various acoustic tests, each one revealing new layers of complexity in the cave's sound patterns. The echoes seemed to change and evolve, sometimes appearing to respond to my movements rather than simply reflecting them. My scientific mind struggled to rationalize what I was experiencing, but the data being captured by my equipment confirmed that something truly unusual was occurring. It was during a pause in my recording that I first heard it, a clear, musical tone that seemed to emanate from deep within the cave system. The sound was unlike anything I had encountered in my years of acoustic research. It hung in the air like frost, crystalline and delicate, before slowly transforming into what could only be described as words, though in no language I could identify. The phenomenon lasted for several minutes, during which time my equipment recorded everything. When I later analyzed the recordings, I found patterns that defied conventional acoustic physics. The sound waves exhibited properties that suggested they were being actively modified as they traveled through the space, as if passing through some kind of natural sound processing system. Professor Wells never appeared, and as the day drew to a close, I packed up my equipment and made my way back to the surface. The forest had grown dark, but the path seemed to illuminate itself just enough for me to find my way back to my vehicle. As I drove home through the gathering night, the strange sounds from the cave seemed to linger in my mind, like half-remembered fragments of a dream. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into analyzing the recorded data. The patterns I discovered suggested the presence of acoustic properties that had never been documented in any natural cave system. But more intriguing were the gaps in the recordings, moments when my equipment had captured nothing at all, despite my clear memory of continuous sound during those periods. I attempted to locate Professor Wells through academic channels, but no one seemed to know of an archaeologist or acoustician by that name. The letter itself, when I examined it more closely, showed signs of age that should have been impossible given how recently I had received it. The paper had become delicate, the ink fading as if it had been written decades ago rather than mere weeks. Sometimes, late at night when the world grows quiet, I find myself listening intently to the ambient sounds around me. In those moments, I could swear I hear echoes of that strange musical tone from the cave, carried on the edge of silence. The rational part of my mind suggests that it's merely an effect of memory and imagination, but my years of scientific training tell me that there are still phenomena in our world that defy conventional explanation. The cave remains there, hidden in its forest sanctuary, its secrets preserved in the complex dance of sound waves through its chambers. I've considered returning, better equipped and perhaps with colleagues to verify my observations. But something holds me back, a sense that some mysteries are meant to remain partially unveiled, existing in the liminal space between scientific understanding and the vast unknown that still surrounds us. As I write this account, I can feel the weight of that ancient paper letter in my hands, though it has long since crumbled to dust. The echoes of that day continue to resonate through my professional work, influencing my research in ways I'm only beginning to understand. And sometimes when the rain falls softly against my window panes, I find myself listening for patterns in its rhythm, wondering if perhaps there are messages encoded in the most ordinary of sounds, waiting for those who know how to listen. The cave taught me that there is a profound difference between hearing and listening, between observing and understanding. Its echoes remain with me, a gentle reminder that in our modern world of scientific certainty, there are still places where mystery dwells, calling to us in voices that transcend the boundaries of conventional acoustic physics. In the end, perhaps that was Professor Wells's true purpose in leading me to that place. Not to solve its mysteries, but to demonstrate that some phenomena exist precisely at the intersection of the explainable and the unknowable, challenging us to expand our understanding while accepting that some questions may never have definitive answers. The rain continues to fall, and in its steady rhythm, I sometimes imagine I hear those cave echoes again, carrying ancient whispers across time and space, reminding me that there are still wonders in this world that exist beyond the reach of our scientific instruments, waiting patiently to be discovered by those willing to listen with both their minds and their hearts. Story 8. The moonlight filtered through the dense autumn fog, casting ethereal shadows across my grandmother's garden. I had inherited her old Victorian house just weeks ago, and tonight marked my first visit since childhood. The air held a peculiar stillness, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the soft patter of evening dew dropping from weathered tree branches. Standing on the wraparound porch, I found myself drawn to the garden that had once been my grandmother's pride. In the silvery moonlight, marble and stone figures dotted the overgrown landscape like silent sentinels. These weren't the pristine statues I remembered from my youth. Each one bore mysterious fractures, as if time itself had reached out with careful fingers to reshape their forms. The night air carried the sweet scent of evening jasmine, mingled with petrichor rising from the damp earth. My footsteps whispered against the stone path as I ventured deeper into the garden, guided by the warm glow of old copper lanterns that still burned with a steady flame, just as they had in my childhood. Their light caught the broken edges of the statues, creating dancing shadows that seemed to breathe life into the cold stone. A cherub with a missing wing held court near a weathered fountain, its remaining hand eternally reaching toward the sky. Beside it, a classical maiden turned her face away, her marble features eroded by countless rainstorms, yet somehow more haunting in their imperfection. Each statue bore similar marks of mysterious damage, clean breaks that seemed too precise to be the work of natural weathering. The air grew heavier as I approached the center of the garden, where the largest statue stood. It was an angel, twice my height, its wings partially crumbled, yet still magnificent. I remembered it whole and unblemished from my childhood visits, its stance proud and protective. Now it bore a network of hairline fractures across its surface, like a delicate spiderweb frozen in stone. As I studied the angel's face, I noticed something peculiar about its eyes. Where they had once gazed straight ahead, they now seemed to look slightly to the left, as if watching something just beyond my peripheral vision. I turned to follow its gaze, but found only more shadowed garden paths and broken figures in the darkness. The sound of wind chimes drew my attention. The old brass ones my grandmother had hung decades ago, still singing their gentle song. Yet there was no breeze to move them. Their quiet melody seemed to whisper ancient secrets, creating a strange harmony with the steady drip of water from the fountain's moss-covered basin. Inside the house, I found my grandmother's journals, their pages filled with careful observations about her garden. Her elegant handwriting spoke of the statues as if they were old friends, each with its own personality and story. But as I read deeper into her later entries, the tone changed. She wrote of movement glimpsed at twilight, of positions shifted ever so slightly between dusk and dawn. The last entry was dated just weeks before her passing. They're trying to tell me something. Every morning, another break appears, another crack forms. Not random damage, it's a language written in broken stone. I'm beginning to understand, but I fear the knowing comes too late. Returning to the garden the next evening, I brought her journal with me. The statues stood in their eternal vigil, yet something felt different. Had that cherub's remaining hand shifted slightly lower? Was the classical maiden's face turned just a fraction more toward the angel? The changes were so subtle they might have been tricks of the changing light. I began spending my evenings in the garden, following my grandmother's example of recording every detail, every minute change. Some mornings I would wake to find new fractures in the statues, always precise and deliberate, like brushstrokes in stone. The breaks formed patterns that teased at the edges of recognition, almost letters, almost words, but not quite. The sounds of the garden became a familiar lullaby, the wind chime's gentle song, the fountain's steady rhythm, the whisper of leaves. Sometimes, in that peaceful space between wakefulness and dreams, I thought I heard something more, a soft grinding of stone against stone, like statues shifting their ancient weight under cover of darkness. Weeks passed, and I noticed my own habits changing to match my grandmother's documented routines. I found myself walking the garden paths at specific times, pausing at certain statues as if following an unwritten choreography. The broken figures seemed to guide my steps, their damaged forms creating a path that felt increasingly familiar. One particularly still night, as I sat beside the fountain recording my observations, I realized something profound about the pattern of breaks in the statues. They weren't random acts of vandalism or natural decay. They formed a circle, each break pointing to the next, leading through the garden in an endless loop. The angel's gaze marked the beginning, or perhaps the end, of this stone cipher. My grandmother's final journal entry took on new meaning. The language of broken stone she mentioned wasn't metaphorical. It was a message left by something that could only communicate through careful destruction. Each crack and fracture was a word, each broken limb a sentence in a story I was only beginning to grasp. The garden holds its secrets still. Some nights, when the moon is full and the fog rolls in, I sit among the broken statues and listen to their silent tale. The wind chimes sing their gentle song, the fountain keeps its steady rhythm, and somewhere in the darkness, stone whispers to stone. I've come to understand that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but rather experienced, like the subtle shift between dusk and dawn, or the endless dance of shadow and light across weathered stone. My own journal grows fuller with each passing night. Like my grandmother before me, I've become a keeper of stone secrets, a witness to the slow conversation of broken statues. And sometimes, in the perfect stillness before sunrise, I think I'm beginning to understand what they're trying to say. But that understanding remains as fragile as morning dew, evaporating with the first light of dawn. Perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some truths are meant to exist only in that liminal space between darkness and light, between sleeping and waking, between broken and whole. The garden has taught me to find peace in that uncertainty, to let the mystery be both question and answer. The statues watch and wait and slowly change, and I watch with them, adding my own quiet presence to their ancient vigil, another guardian of this garden of broken dreams and whispered stories. Story 9. The autumn wind whispered through the branches of the ancient oak tree, its weathered bark holding centuries of secrets within its deep furrows. I had passed by this majestic sentinel countless times during my evening walks, but tonight something felt different. The air carried an unusual stillness, heavy with the sweet scent of decaying leaves and rain-soaked earth. My footsteps crunched softly against the carpet of fallen leaves as I approached the massive trunk. The oak's branches stretched toward the pearl-gray sky like gnarled fingers, their shadows dancing across the ground in the fading twilight. A gentle mist had begun to settle, creating an ethereal veil that transformed the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. I had always been drawn to this particular tree. Its enormous trunk, wider than any other in the woods, spoke of ages past. Local folklore suggested it was over 500 years old, though no one knew for certain. What stories could it tell, I wondered, if trees could speak? What secrets lay buried beneath its sprawling roots? As I stood there lost in contemplation, a peculiar detail caught my eye. Near the base of the trunk, partially obscured by a thick root, was a small opening I had never noticed before. The recent rains must have eroded some of the soil around it, revealing what appeared to be a carefully carved hollow. The wood around its edges was smooth, weathered by time but clearly shaped by human hands. The gentle patter of raindrops began to fall through the canopy above, creating a soothing rhythm against the leaves. I knelt down, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity. The hollow seemed to hold something, though the growing darkness made it difficult to discern what lay within. Reaching into my coat pocket, I retrieved my phone and activated its flashlight. The beam illuminated the cavity, revealing a small wooden box, its surface darkened with age. It appeared to have been crafted from the same wood as the tree itself, as if it were meant to become one with its guardian. My fingers trembled slightly as I carefully extracted it from its resting place, feeling the weight of history in my hands. The box was surprisingly warm to the touch, despite the cool evening air. Its surface bore intricate carvings, delicate spirals and flowing lines that seemed to shift and move in the play of shadow and light. There was no lock, only a simple wooden clasp that had somehow survived the passage of time. A distant roll of thunder echoed through the woods, and the rainfall gradually intensified. I found shelter beneath the oak's vast canopy, settling onto a protruding root that formed a natural seat. The box rested in my lap, both intriguing and slightly unnerving. The wind picked up, causing the branches above to creak and sway, their movement creating ever-changing patterns in the misty air. With careful movements, I undid the clasp. The lid opened with surprising ease, as if the box had been waiting for this moment. Inside, nestled in a bed of what appeared to be dried moss, lay a small leather-bound journal and something wrapped in faded silk. The journal's pages were yellowed, but remarkably preserved, protected from the elements by its wooden sanctuary. As I gently lifted the journal, a sweet, unfamiliar fragrance wafted up from its pages. It reminded me of summer flowers and autumn spices, yet was unlike anything I had encountered before. The handwriting inside was elegant, but difficult to decipher in the dim light. What I could make out spoke of dreams and visions, of nights spent beneath this very tree during full moons long past. The silk-wrapped object proved to be a pendant of some kind, crafted from a material that seemed to absorb and reflect light in impossible ways. It was neither metal nor stone, warm like wood but smooth as glass. As I held it up, the rain-scattered light caught its surface, creating tiny rainbows that danced across my palm. The journal entries spoke of a woman who had lived centuries ago. She wrote of strange lights in the woods, of voices carried on the wind, and of dreams that seemed more real than waking life. According to her words, the pendant had come to her during one such dream, delivered by beings she described as neither flesh nor spirit, but something in between. The rain continued its gentle symphony as I read, each page revealing more mysteries than answers. The woman wrote of using the pendant to see beyond the veil of ordinary reality, of glimpsing worlds that existed alongside our own. Her last entry, dated near the winter solstice, spoke of an impending journey, one she knew she might not return from. The oak will guard these secrets, she had written, until one who understands comes to claim them. The pendant knows its keeper, and the keeper will know the pendant. Time means nothing to those who dwell in the spaces between moments. As I read these words, the pendant in my palm grew noticeably warmer. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist, and in the distance I could see the first stars beginning to peek through breaks in the clouds. The oak's branches swayed gently, creating a sound like distant whispers. I carefully returned the journal to its box, but found myself unable to part with the pendant. It felt right somehow, as if it had been waiting all these years specifically for this moment. As I stood to leave, something made me look back at the hollow where I had found the box. In the growing darkness, I could have sworn I saw a soft, phosphorescent glow emanating from within. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the continuing rainfall, the pendant rested on my nightstand, its strange material catching the moonlight that filtered through my window. Just before drifting off to sleep, I noticed something peculiar. The shadows it cast on my wall didn't quite match its shape, and they seemed to move independently of any external light source. In the months that followed, I returned to the oak many times, sometimes finding new details in the journal entries, sometimes sitting in peaceful contemplation beneath its ancient boughs. The pendant became a constant companion, and though I could never quite prove it, I began to notice subtle changes in how I perceived the world around me. Colors seemed more vivid, particularly during twilight hours. The wind's whispers occasionally carried fragments of conversations I couldn't quite understand. Dreams became more vivid, filled with images of distant places and times that felt as real as my waking life. The old oak still stands, its secrets mostly intact. Sometimes, when I pass by during my evening walks, I notice other people pausing beneath its branches, looking thoughtful or touching its bark with wondering expressions. I often think about the woman who left her story hidden within the tree's heart, and I wonder if she too walks these woods still, in some form or another. The pendant grows warm against my skin as these thoughts cross my mind, and the wind through the oak's leaves sounds almost like laughter. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be fully understood, but rather experienced and accepted for what they are. gentle reminders that the world is far more wonderful and strange than we imagine. As for the box and journal, they remain where I found them, tucked safely back into their hollow. After all, the oak has guarded them well for centuries. Who am I to interfere with such dedicated service? Sometimes late at night, I wonder if another wanderer will someday discover them, beginning their own journey into the mysteries that dwell in the spaces between moments. The pendant continues to show me glimpses of things I can't quite explain, and the dreams it brings are more vivid than ever. But that's a story for another time, one that's still unfolding with each passing day. For now, I'm content to walk beneath the ancient oak's branches, listening to the whispers of secrets carried on the wind, and wondering what other mysteries might be waiting to be discovered by those who take the time to truly look. Story 10. The autumn air whispered through the trees, carrying the subtle scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. I stood at the edge of my property, watching as tendrils of mist began their nightly dance across the old stone bridge. The structure had always held a certain magnetism, its weathered gray stones bearing silent witness to countless crossings over the generations. Tonight, though, something felt different about its familiar silhouette against the darkening sky. The moon hung above, partially obscured by thin clouds that drifted like gauze across its face. Its diffused light cast soft shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own, creating patterns that drew my eye again and again to the bridge's worn surface. The sound of the stream below was gentle, a continuous murmur that had become the soundtrack to my evenings since moving to this remote home 3 months ago. My nightly walks had become a ritual, a way to clear my mind before settling in for sleep. The property's extensive grounds offered plenty of space to wander, but I always found myself drawn to this particular spot. The bridge marked the boundary of my land, connecting it to an old forest trail that wound deeper into the woods. I had never ventured across after sunset, content to let the bridge serve as a quiet sentinel between the known and unknown. The air grew cooler as I stood there, and I pulled my sweater closer around my shoulders. The wool was soft against my skin, a comfort against the growing chill. A slight breeze carried the musty scent of river water and wet stone, mingling with the earthy aroma of moss that grew in patches along the bridge's base. The sound of an owl calling in the distance added to the evening's peaceful atmosphere. As I watched, the mist began to thicken, pooling around the bridge's stone foundations like water filling a basin. The effect was mesmerizing, the way the fog seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with some unseen tide. In the diffused moonlight, the mist took on an almost luminescent quality, giving the bridge an ethereal appearance that made it seem as though it were floating between two worlds. I had always been fascinated by the bridge's history. The real estate agent had mentioned it was at least 200 years old, built by the original settlers of this area. Its construction was remarkable. Massive stones fitted together with such precision that they had withstood centuries of weather without showing signs of structural weakness. The craftsmanship spoke of a time when things were built to last, to stand against both the elements and time itself. A slight movement caught my eye, drawing my attention to the center of the bridge. For a moment I thought I saw a figure standing there, a darker shadow among the shadows. But when I focused my gaze, there was nothing but mist and moonlight. Still, something about that glimpse left me with an odd sensation, as though I had accidentally interrupted a private moment. The breeze picked up slightly, carrying with it the sound of rustling leaves and something else. Something that might have been footsteps, or might have been the gentle settling of ancient stone. I found myself holding my breath, straining to identify the sound. It came again, a soft scraping noise that seemed to emanate from the bridge itself, as though the old stones were shifting in their sleep. My rational mind suggested it was simply the natural sounds of an old structure cooling in the evening air. But another part of me wondered. There were stories about this bridge, whispered tales I'd overheard at the local market. The older residents spoke of strange experiences, glimpses of figures that vanished when directly observed, the sound of footsteps when no one was there, the feeling of being watched while crossing at twilight. I had dismissed these stories as local folklore, the kind of tales that naturally gather around any old structure. But standing there in the growing darkness, watching the interplay of moonlight and mist, I found myself reconsidering. There was something about the bridge that invited contemplation, that suggested possibilities beyond our everyday understanding of the world. The mist continued to thicken, and I noticed that the temperature had dropped further. My breath now formed visible clouds in the air, adding to the dreamlike quality of the scene. The stream's whisper seemed to have changed its tone, becoming something more melodic, almost like distant voices engaged in conversation just below the threshold of comprehension. I took a few steps closer to the bridge, drawn by some inexplicable curiosity. The worn stones of the pathway felt solid beneath my feet, each step accompanied by the subtle crunch of gravel. As I approached, I noticed details that had escaped my attention before. The way certain stones seemed to catch and hold the moonlight, the subtle patterns of lichen that traced mysterious designs across the surface, the deeper shadows that pooled in the spaces between the stones. Reaching out, I placed my hand against one of the bridge's support pillars. The stone was cool and slightly damp beneath my palm, but there was something else, a subtle vibration, so faint I might have imagined it, like the lingering echo of footsteps long past. The sensation triggered an unexpected flood of images in my mind, glimpses of people crossing the bridge through the years, each generation adding their own stories to its history. A sudden gust of wind stirred the mist into swirling patterns, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw faces in the fog, fleeting impressions of features that dissolved as quickly as they formed. The moonlight seemed to pulse, creating shadows that moved in ways that defied logical explanation. Yet somehow I felt no fear. Instead, there was a sense of recognition, as though I were witnessing something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. The owl called again, closer this time, its voice carrying clearly through the night air. Something about its cry seemed to break the spell, and I realized how long I had been standing there, lost in contemplation. The mist had completely enveloped the bridge now, making it impossible to see the other side. The moon had risen higher, its light creating a silver halo through the thin cloud cover. As I prepared to turn back toward my house, something made me pause. There, in the very center of the bridge, where the mist was thickest, I saw what appeared to be a door, not a physical door, but rather a suggestion of one, formed by the interplay of light and shadow. It seemed to hover just above the bridge's surface, its edges softly blurred by the surrounding fog. The sight held me transfixed. The door appeared both inviting and slightly unnerving, like a threshold waiting to be crossed. The moonlight caught the swirling mist around it, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, though in no alphabet I had ever seen. The longer I stared, the more distinct the door became, until I could almost convince myself I could see what lay beyond it. A gentle wind brushed past me, carrying with it the faint sound of music, or perhaps it was laughter, from somewhere on the other side of the bridge. The sound was tantalizingly familiar, yet impossible to identify. It stirred something deep in my memory, like a half-remembered dream trying to surface into consciousness. I found myself taking another step toward the bridge, drawn by an irresistible curiosity. The gravel crunched softly beneath my feet, each step bringing me closer to that mysterious threshold. The vibration I had felt earlier seemed to grow stronger, rising up through the soles of my shoes. It was like a pulse now, matching the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The mist parted slightly as I approached, creating a path that led directly to the center of the bridge. The moonlight seemed to concentrate there, illuminating that strange, ethereal doorway. I could now see that the patterns around it were moving, slowly rotating like the hands of some cosmic clock. The sound of the stream below had faded to a whisper, replaced by a deep silence that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Standing at the edge of the bridge, I faced a choice. The rational part of my mind urged caution, reminded me of the late hour and the comfort of my warm house waiting behind me. But another part, a deeper part that recognized the rarity of such moments, whispered of possibilities. The door still hung there in the mist, neither fully real nor entirely imagined, waiting. I took one more step onto the bridge, feeling the ancient stones solid beneath my feet despite the surrounding mist. The vibration was clearer now, carrying with it fragments of sound, distant conversations, footsteps, laughter, all overlapping like layers of time compressed into a single moment. The moonlight caught the swirling fog, creating patterns that seemed to write and rewrite themselves in the air around me. Whether I continued forward or turned back, I knew this moment had changed something. The bridge was no longer simply a structure of stone and mortar, but a threshold between worlds, not just between the physical spaces it connected, but between the known and the unknown, between what we understand and what we sense lies just beyond our understanding. The moon continued its passage across the sky, its light playing through the thin clouds. The mist swirled and danced around the bridge, sometimes revealing, sometimes concealing that mysterious doorway at its center. And I stood there, balanced between decision and indecision, while the night held its breath and waited. In the end, I kept the choice I made to myself. Some experiences I've learned are better left in that realm of uncertainty where mystery and reality merge. The bridge still stands, of course, solid and real in the daylight, but now, on certain nights when the moon is veiled and the mist rises from the stream, I find myself drawn back to that spot, watching and wondering about what lies just beyond the threshold of our everyday world. The tales about the bridge continue to circulate, whispered over coffee at the local diner, or shared during quiet evening gatherings. I listen to them now with different ears, neither believing nor disbelieving, but understanding that some places serve as anchors for the mysteries that drift at the edges of our world. The bridge remains, spanning not just the physical gap between its banks, but the space between what we know and what we sense might be possible. And sometimes, on very quiet nights when the moon plays hide and seek with the clouds, I still hear that distant music carried on the breeze. Whether it comes from the other side of the bridge or from somewhere deeper in memory, I can no longer say. Perhaps in the end, the distinction doesn't really matter. The mystery itself is enough.